All right, so our final speaker for the day, Mr. Saeed could not be here today and does apologize for not being able to be with us, but looks forward to joining us for the next Craft Studies conference that we have. But I'm pleased to welcome to the podium today Alison Renna. Alison is a PhD candidate in Religious Studies and History of Science and Medicine at Yale University. At Yale, she teaches about fundamental problems in thought that arise in interpretations of reality in the life sciences. She has founded and runs the Undergraduate Science Studies Workshop at Yale, in addition to her work on the philosophy of science. She is a 2024 Institute for Social Policy Studies Fellow at Yale, in which role she is arguing that the preamble to the U.S. Constitution should be returned to a central place in U.S. constitutional interpretation. Amen to that. The preamble clearly states that future generations are equal stakeholders in U.S. law to living citizens, and she is exploring the impact of such a statement on U.S. environmental law. So without further ado, if everyone could welcome to the podium Alison Renna.
So it is an absolute honor for me to be here speaking in front of all of you after I've had the privilege of doing, thank you. Speaking in front of you, after I've had the privilege of doing some research in the Southern Highland Craft Guild archives. I cannot thank Matt enough for organizing and Mike enough for the work he's done to make this research possible. His expertise has been extraordinary and full of wise counsel, although I want to note that any errors I might make in this talk are mine and not his. Can everybody hear me okay? Kind of like a quiet mouse voice. Okay, good. So I want to begin by asking if anyone here might have known Southern Highland Craft Guild member Charles Counts?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Or his friend, the physician Ralph Nisley.
I'm sorry, but she's still Ralph Nisley? Dr. Ralph Nisley? No, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. Well, I welcome any comments and criticisms from you today because he is going to be one of the central characters that's going to take us through an episode in the nuclear era that right now is not yet written down in the history books of science in the mid-20th century. So the story that has emerged out of my research here and in the Berea College archives in Kentucky and in the Atomic Energy Commission archives in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and in the United Nations archives in Vienna, Austria, has provided evidence of an episode in the history of science which hasn't yet been written into our history books about a dimension of a change that happened in the 1960s and 70s and how we think about the nature of human being as a phrase and life itself in the life sciences. Scientists and members of the public began thinking of life in this period as something they could describe in the language of systems, ecosystems, planetary systems, nervous systems, neural networks, internal family systems, social networks. Charles Counts and Ralph Nisley's lives brought them to the epicenter of these changes, and their friendship is an instructive lens through which we can view the story of how systems started feeling like something which could describe so many of life's dimensions, from its physical structure to what the human is. And before I jump in, I want to explain a little bit how I arrived at this question. My training and research as a scholar is in how the concept of human nature, those paired terms, human and nature, has changed over time in religion, philosophy, and after the early 20th century when the sciences consolidated for the first time in the life sciences. So in 2007, a really big shift happened. I'm not going to change the slide. I'm going to do this. At the computer. Thank you.
There we go. It went to sleep.
Okay,
now
thank you.
will work.
Great. So here is Charles Counts, and here's Ralph Nisley, our two main characters. We'll see some more photos of them as we go along. Okay, so in 2007, a big shift happened in the life sciences, kind of under the radar, but which has shaped how we talk about human nature and our relationship to the environment in a pretty dramatic way. For the first time, US government scientists, here we can see the example of the Human Microbiome Project, which was run through the US National Institutes of Health, started arguing that the human beings can be accurately described as ecosystems because scientists were realizing how many essential functions of the human body are performed not by structures in our bodies, which are coded for by human DNA, but which are coded for by the microorganisms that live in and on our bodies, which they collectively call the microbiome. Those scientists argued that because microbes did so many things that our body needs done, we should think of microbial DNA as human DNA, and that the human is one big human and microbe genomic organism. Not long after, scientists realized that the microbiome was also shaping how the brain works. They were dramatically influencing expressions of anxiety, depression, social behavior, autism, all conditions we normally associate with our internal lives. So rather than just thinking of the body's structure and physiology as an ecosystem, scientists at the US National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health began calling for a revolution in the philosophy of how we think about our human being, as something that is shaped by the global ecosystems that shape our body's private microbial ecosystem. A new field of philosophy popped up to talk through these questions. Research centers blossomed at universities across the world where microbiologists and philosophers are working side by side to understand the human ecosystem. And the consumer economy, never to be left behind, has also caught on. More yogurt and kombucha and probiotic packaging began promising you personal and spiritual transformation if you eat their microbes. Then truly, and I can say this confidently as a historian, they had ever asked before. However, as a historian of ideas, I wondered if we all might be moving a little fast by jumping into the idea that we are ecosystems without some reflection on what the human becomes if we think about it through the same interpretive language we use to understand lakes and oceans and bacterial mats. The ecosystems idea in science is really young. It only started to take on its modern valences around 1949. And I couldn't help but think that if we didn't start to try and understand the history of how this popular image of the ecosystem arose and took on the valences of conceptual meaning that it has today, we might be in danger of losing parts of our ability to describe some aspects of the richness of the human condition that don't fit easily into the systems model, like, say, our conscious experience of our lives, which, unlike our physical form, cannot really be reduced to particles or energetic signals because we experience them. So I started looking into the history of the ecosystems concept, and that research brought me somewhere I was not expecting, back to the very end of the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. In fact, as we follow Counts and Nisley, we will see many proto-elements of this idea of the ecological self pass through Oak Ridge as they were being developed, and today I want to highlight 3 of them specifically. First, we're going to talk about the ecosystems concept, but we're also going to talk about the centrality of DNA for understanding life. And thirdly, we'll talk about the idea that the human mind can be described as a system. In Counts and Nisley's story, we see these points of emphasis of systems fever develop, which I think shows us both of their powers and some of their limitations. So the story begins in 1942, when the US government started pouring unprecedented resources into developing an effective technology to isolate enough radioactive atoms to build the atomic bomb. And one of the 2 major sites where they produced those atoms was in the Clinch River Valley in Anderson County in eastern Tennessee. Families from across the nation poured into Tennessee to man the labs. Potter and scholar Charles Counts' family was among them. He spent his teenage years in Oak Ridge while his father worked at the labs. During the war, the labs produced quantities of concentrated radioactive materials which had been previously unknown in the history of the world. And I want to note that through the rest of the talk, I'm going to be using the word radioisotopes to describe these atoms, which is really just a mashup of the 2 words radioactive and isotope, which is atoms when they're in this radioactive state. So there were many consequences to the stockpiling of radioisotopes that the technicians at the lab did not expect. Atoms lodged themselves into workers' bodies, lying latent for decades before killing them slowly with cancers and diseases of the organs. While the teenage children of staff members, like Counts, were attending dances in the Oak Ridge Community Center, the labs were dumping the radioactive waste into a pond near the laboratories, which drained into the Clinch River. It was only after the war, when Counts moved away to Berea College to attend college and learn his history and his pottery, that the scientists began to be able to understand the consequences of that decision. So when new ideas appear in the history of science, it often takes generations for researchers to start piecing together a coherent theory of the new phenomenon. In the beginning, much escapes them. Radiation pollution is no different. Science had barely any intellectual resources to understand pollution of that type, but here it was, and there was so much of it. Oak Ridge researchers created a new language to trace the path of radioactive particles as they moved through the bodies of algae, fish, birds, and humans who spent their time in or near that polluted lake, the language of ecosystems. While ecosystems research had been developed among a small minority of biologists prior to the Second World War, Oak Ridge researchers transformed it into a mathematical language for tracing quantities of radioactive particles which move through the bodies of living things. They drew from mathematical models called cybernetics, developed by the British military during the war for predicting the unpredictable decisions a fighter pilot might make while in the air, which produced a mathematical theory of feedback loops for the first time. This was integral to the development of the computer, and everything the computer has given us was accompanied by our understanding of neuroscience specifically, and the other computing disciplines. Later, the ecologists realized that their ecosystems models, which quantified the movement of particles among different living things, followed the same structural principles, and that ecosystems might be used to describe any material or energetic exchange among living things in nature. This is the first time we see an early version of the ecosystems concept, which gives us the Human Microbiome Project's idea of the human self as an ecology. They developed the idea that where particles are exchanged among living things, an ecosystem can be found, and we live with that legacy. With the success of this work, after the war, Oak Ridge supported the formation of new environmental science departments. The language of systems was also spreading throughout other disciplines. Like the ecologists studying radioactive particles moving through the lake, physicians started tracing the movement of radioactive particles through the human body. In many ways, systems became the language of life after the war because of their usefulness for mapping the structure of the body and the nature that surrounds that body. Enter Ralph Nisley, one of 12 young physicians recruited by Oak Ridge to research the potential of radioisotopes to teach us about bodily processes. Like isotopes in ecosystems, isotopes could be intentionally placed in the body to track different metabolic processes and to treat diseases like cancer, where radioactivity's deadly properties might be used intentionally to kill cancer cells. Nisley was born in Pennsylvania, and a childhood friend recruited him to work at the labs after medical school. He arrived in 1951 when Oak Ridge began training physicians in the use of radioisotopes in cancer treatment, as well as shipping their isotopes throughout the country for medical use. Nisley helped to train physicians from all over the world in using these byproducts of the bomb, which had been originally created to do so much harm, in treatment to heal the human body instead. Meanwhile, Nisley also had what he later called a thriving extracurricular life amidst that work. He and his spouse, Helen Sutton Nisley, became active in the theater community in Oak Ridge and in the Unitarian Church. Through that church, they and their 4 children protested against racial segregation in Oak Ridge businesses and schools throughout the 1950s and early 60s. Nisley was a painter, and he joined the local arts community, where he created activist artwork, as well as scenes from his life in the Clinch River Valley. Here I have a painting of the Clinch River, where that nuclear pollution was still flowing in force when he lived there. Through this community work, Nisley met Counts, who was active in the desegregation movement as a young artist, who had returned to the city and made his pottery there for a short time. Although Counts later moved away, he remained in the orbit of Oak Ridge for the rest of his life. In 1961, after a decade working in medicine in Oak Ridge, Nisley's spouse, Helen, died. He asked Counts to make a mural in Helen's memory. Counts did. This is an image of the mosaic, which was later damaged in a fire, as you can see some of the discoloration on the image to the left. But in the image of the organic material and the trees, to the right, there are some detailed photos of the mural taken before the fire. Barren, but standing, you can see what I find to be a striking portrait of grief in the shadow of a life lost. So Counts, as many of the people in this room know, also made much activist artwork during his lifetime. Some of the focus of that activist artwork was about the civil rights movement, like the pots behind me, and some were responding to what he had seen at Oak Ridge as a child during the Manhattan Project. Counts thought of craft itself as something that was inherently in opposition to runaway science, like that which took place at Oak Ridge, because, as he argued, craft requires an expression of the human spirit that enlivens the craft person in practice and remains in the spirit of an object. In a poem he wrote called Oak Rigidness, he reflected on the hypocrisy that shaped life in Oak Ridge in those years. In a society which was decidedly not spiritually integrated in the way he felt craft had helped him to become. In the poem, Counts remembers the contrast of the way adults punished children in the community for small moral transgressions, while the adults were quite literally gathered to develop a weapon of mass murder. Counts called the kind of contradictory moral thought he observed among the adults a, quote, meanwhile morality, end quote, in the poem. What he meant by this was that they were able to split the world up too neatly, taking responsibility for the small elements of their private lives, but ignoring the kinds of danger they were creating in the world and for themselves by participating in what he called in the poem, quote, big government toying with unwitting fire, end quote. He expresses a difficulty here for self-understanding for anyone, like all of us, who live our daily lives in one way with specific moral ideals and goals, while also without our real conscious choice contributing to large-scale structures which do the kind of violence none of us would have chosen to enact ourselves. When the clothes we buy were made by enslaved people in other countries, the way we get around heats the atmosphere, on, and the elements of chance which enable us to survive despite the forms of evil we create. There was an element of this which criticized the kinds of lives, especially that people in Oak Ridge, like Ralph Nisley, were still living. Nisley especially was precisely part of the government, quote, toying with unwitting fire, end quote, that Counts was criticizing. So in 1962, shortly after his wife's death, Nisley traveled to Japan to teach nuclear medicine techniques to Japanese scientists treating bomb survivors. Studies in the United States conducted in Japan on survivors of the nuclear bomb had yielded crucial insights which would provide the foundation of much knowledge in the life sciences for the 20th century. But the US is still the only country to have used the bomb in war. And this knowledge came from studies of the aftermath of the atomic bomb conducted by the United States in Japan on survivors, which the US government conducted without providing any medical or psychological therapy for the survivors. They studied them, but they didn't treat them. Historian Susan Lindy suggests that the reason the United States refused to supply treatment to those survivors was because they were afraid that any recognition that they had caused harm in the country would look like remorse, and remorse would lead to a trial for war crimes. So those studied contributed to foundational knowledge about, first, DNA, and secondly, psychological trauma, by laying the groundwork for what would become the models of the human body and the mind of the 20th century, which would help shape the microbiome concept. Nisley offered isotopes to Japanese scientists, products of the same laboratory that created the devastation they were trying to heal, and the place from which Nisley drew his paycheck. A meanwhile problem, in Counts' words. Nisley wanted to help heal patients, but how much harm was created by the institutions through which he worked. In Counts' writing after this point, he began toying with the idea that if one could only understand the whole of things, the whole system, you could minimize violence and harm because you could understand and avoid evil where it springs up. All variables accounted for, no element left behind. Moral reflection took on a prominent role in his work. In 1964, he made a mural called The Activity of God Through Time, which was hung just down the road at the entryway to the Warren Wilson College Chapel, which explores these themes of responsibility, good and evil, and the meanwhile, in Counts' words, in really vivid terms, which is why I'd like to discuss it in a little bit of depth today. Counts welcomed the Chattanooga Daily Times to photograph him and his collaborator and spouse, Ruby Nell Counts, as they made the mural. Counts walked the reporters through his method of construction. He cut tesserae into wet clay, dried and fired them, glazed them, then set them on plywood and grouted them. I also want to note that this piece was not the only work by a guild member in the chapel. The altar cross is made out of walnut wood and was made by Hardy Davidson. So when Counts made this mosaic, which you can see just above the doors, this is a zoomed up picture, but we're going to look at close-ups. He was anointing the building with a very specific way of depicting the events of the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels. One that is, in my interpretation, a very intensely moral reading of those books. The Bible can tell a moral story, but it's not necessary or given that it would. So we can see this was very much a choice by Counts. In the first panel, Counts depicts the creation of the world from the book of Genesis, the first book of the Hebrew Bible. This panel shows images drawn from the events of Genesis 1-3, the creation of plants and animals, the sun and the moon, light and dark, and also the people, depicted in a key moment of the plot of Genesis, when they violate the moral command given to them by God, not to do one thing, to eat a specific fruit, initiating them into the first act of moral failure in human history. God punishes them by cursing them to generations of consequence, in which they will suffer again and again the trial of estrangement from the good, the right, and the true. In the second panel, we see action amidst a journey. God commanding one of those first two people's descendants, Abraham, to leave his homeland and learn to live with those beyond the community. That same God gave Abraham's descendant, Moses, a set of moral laws, which we see represented here through the very recognizable image of the tablets. The ethical challenges which would be brought to them on this journey are more voluminous than I can discuss now, but among them were the arrivals of the prophets Isaiah and Amos, who Count said are the men depicted here. Isaiah commanded the people to beat their swords into plowshares, to obliterate violence. Amos faced God and told him he had gone too far in his punishment of the humans, to take the punishment back, and to whom God listened. These two figures represent a profound story of moral unfolding in the Bible, where God and man learn about what is right and good, not in the relationship of tyranny, where God provides the moral rule on the basis of an unquestioned authority, but in which God and man learn together. When the story moves to the Gospels, it is this right and the good that is at issue with the coming of the new prophet. In the fourth panel, Jesus, the figure at the center of the Christian tradition, connects the Hebrew Bible with the Gospels, the accounts of his life. God's omnipotence is represented here through the all-seeing eye. In the fifth panel, the cross arrives, a recognizable icon of the sacrifice Jesus made to buy the possibility of forgiveness. To buy the possibility of forgiveness for those who would believe in the possibility of forgiveness. Jesus is accompanied by the phoenix, representing rebirth and his resurrection from the dead. There are other symbols of the early church, including a dove with an olive branch, an image from the Hebrew Bible repeated in an echo of God's forgiveness. In these panels, we're seeing a selective retelling of the story of Christian scripture, a version of the conversation with God that leans towards peace, the community learning and renewing moral law. But the tableau doesn't end there. The last panel features not just biblical time and this activity of God through time, it extends into Counts' time, his modernity, which includes, as you can see, the symbol of the atom next to the symbol of the cross. In this artwork, the atom is a characteristic of the same universe in which Adam and Eve, Abraham, the prophets, Christ lived. Also note that the peace dove, once again, is below the atom. Here is the choice Count says to us through the mural. The atom's power has been used to produce profound evil. But there's also the flip side of the possible relationship we might have to the atom, the choice of moral redemption, where the atom and the nation might not be turned towards war again. Through this mural, we see a moral voice develop for Counts, which repeats through his work. So upon returning to Oak Ridge from Japan later that year, Counts' friend Nisley assumed leadership of the medical division. They were advancing nuclear medicine, though the process was marred by human cost. Allegations of experimental abuses surfaced under Nisley's tenure. One notable case involved the enrollment of a man in a radiation study, which was supposed to be an experimental study in how to treat cancer, although he died from the experimental treatments that he was exposed to. This was relatively par for the course in the experimental process. However, it came out later that the man never had cancer. He was misdiagnosed by the physicians at Oak Ridge. And Health Physics Division Director Carl Z. Morgan exposed these incidents, specifically revealing that the labs, whenever they made these kinds of mistakes, took the medical records and classified them so that neither the families nor journalists could find out what had happened. Amidst this controversy, Nisley's boss, lab director Alvin Weinberg, started advocating for the integration of system sciences to unify scientific knowledge, hoping that systems could extend beyond analyzing bodies and ecosystems to encompass society, psychology, philosophy, and what he called the arts, which might, in his vision, unify together as a single system, which could bring ethics into the scientific process. Like Counts, Weinberg hoped that integrating more of the human being into science might help avoid the kinds of blindnesses which had marked science during and in the wake of the bomb project. Howard Odum, a renowned systems ecologist at the labs, proposed in a best-selling book that ecosystems ought to become the basis of a new social morality and a new religion, which would depict the moral good simply as the efficient use of resources in an ecosystem. He hoped that this would in some way redeem science from its destructive legacy in the post-bomb era by making ethics, again, part of scientific thought. The concept of systems, once limited to natural structures, was expanding at Oak Ridge in the minds of many scientific thinkers to encompass more than patterns in nature. They wanted to encompass the human experience itself. They wanted to enhance the credibility of scientific practice by folding ethical imperatives into science rather than treating them like an afterthought. Despite the controversy of the work at the medical division, patients who participated in experimental radiation studies for cancer and their families donated funds to create a memorial for the people who had died in those studies. Nisley asked his friend Charles Counts to make the memorial for the labs. The imagery here might be familiar. In signature Counts style, It is a 12-foot mural with 6 leaves opening around the image of a dove holding an olive branch in its beak, the biblical image of redemption in the wake of profound sin, repeated in the Wilson Memorial. This was the hope that Counts shared with practitioners of atomic medicine, which he helped them to articulate, that at least out of the creation of a weapon had come a therapy which might in some cases save lives. Not long after, Nistli moved to Vienna, Austria. He was appointed head of the Life Sciences Division of the International Atomic Energy Agency, an agency of the United Nations. In that role, he spread Oak Ridge's nuclear ecology and nuclear medicine practices around the world. At home, Counts' name remained well known in the laboratory, not just because of the success of the medical division mural. He was running art shows in Oak Ridge, where his work was purchased and beloved by the scientists who worked in the labs. And he had some national attention. Coretta Scott King even owned his work. Through that work, he continued his commentary on the moral balances of what was happening in the labs. I want to read one of his extended notes here, which he wrote to hang on the wall during one of his art shows in Oak Ridge City. I would delude myself to think that only peace and the development of the human potential will be a paradoxical result of something like the Oak Ridge effort. Yet in growing up in this city, some inner voice caused me to react against the inhumane use of science. As a craftsman, I have reacted unconsciously to the region. I found Oak Ridge persons to be equally concerned about life forces. And the years of interaction have created thousands of pottery pieces, like words in time and space, always the ultimate human hope, that human beings can be civilized, and that days can be filled with strength and beauty and peace, balancing somehow despair and ugliness and fear. He was a critic of Oak Ridge, but he was also valued by Oak Ridge. After the show, the labs found themselves with one more requirement of Charles Counts. In the early 1970s, environmental scientists at Oak Ridge were finally granted their own research center, an affirmation of the importance of their research and investment in that research's continuation. The head of the division, Edward Struckness, asked Counts to make a mural to represent the environmental sciences building as he had at the medical division. Counts called it Trees for Life. They hung it on the side of the building with the description Counts wrote. In an oral history interview recorded about 40 years later, Struckness said that there had been, quote, a lot of controversy, end quote, about the mural among laboratory workers. And I want to read Counts' description to you, which is listed here in the image to the right. So the piece's title is Trees for Life. The tree is our life, and our life is in the tree. It is from this concept that my work has grown for this outdoor mural. The flat mosaics delineate my abstract visual ideas concerning the environment. Sketches from nature, the color balance in various earth tones, and the sun are utilized to convey a certain spirituality about growing things. The most powerful aspect of the mural is the negative spaces between the 9 mosaic panels, by means of which I have created the essence of Trees for Life. Charles Counts, 1977. Few ecologists likely would have objected to the depiction of components of nature they had studied for decades. After all, the fish and the birds depicted here had been subjects of their first pioneering studies. But it was the claim about what the depiction added up to, the spirituality, which created controversy. But what kind of spirituality was Counts talking about? It's difficult to know precisely what Counts meant when he used that word. Biographically, he had contact with a few different religious traditions. But if we just read what he's written here, if the negative spaces between the panels depict the most powerful aspect of the mural, and spirituality names both the growing things depicted and the distinctions between them, together the substance of the work and its negative spaces compose the whole of the artwork, where living things share their life, a spiritual thing, as much as they are separated living things. A common life force, to count quotes from what he'd written for his show. This mosaic was not only used as an architectural adornment, it was also used as the official seal for the laboratory documents for decades. Here the labs were saying out loud, when we study ecosystems, we do not just study the structures of things, the material of things. We study the consummate activity of life, here called spirit. The photo to the right is taken from an Oak Ridge report published in the early 1990s. When Jimmy Carter visited the laboratories later that year, Director Herman Potsma wrote to Counts to tell him that the labs had chosen Charles Counts' mural to symbolize their scientists' quote, multifaceted approach, complete dedication, and continuing concern, end quote. That there was no better articulation of the work happening in the labs than Counts' mural for the Environmental Sciences Division. That they chose a certain spirituality of living things as their choice to represent the work of scientists working at a nuclear lab contracted by the US military and corporations, is, in my opinion, a pretty fascinating turn in the events of the history of US military power. Counts hoped that Oak Ridge would evolve by embracing holistic approaches, bridging gaps in scientific understanding with human conscious through thinking, which could encompass more of a human reality. The labs, too, shared this hope by embracing systems work to capture life's complexity. This is not a moment where art and philosophy were an accessory to science, merely communicating what the ideas science was making. Put an extra what in, sorry, merely communicating the ideas that science was making. It is a moment when the spirit of art, craft, and philosophy provided US nuclear science at the heart of Cold War empire with a mode of expression for their knowledge that could contain the metaphysical elements about human existence the scientists felt was lying latent in their ideas. In other words, it was a moment of real collaboration among art, philosophy, and science. But the labs, as much as they struggled to find some language or models through which science might become more morally responsible, kept practicing the form of science Counts and others criticized. They were still a nuclear lab. They were still helping to make weapons of war. They still did heavily criticized medical studies. System studies strove to become more holistic. They came with a more holistic language, a more holistic aesthetic, but they also just as easily applied to militarized projects as earlier scientific ideas had. They didn't come loaded with an ethical sensibility. That had to be added by the people who applied the system's models, and often it wasn't. Neither did any of the people working with these ideas somehow arrive at a more moral way of living through a systems view. Counts and Nissley and Weinberg and Odom all had profound personal failings compared to the morality they articulated in their public lives, as most people do. This story is mostly focused on the relationship between systems models and morality, which is an important part of this story. But beyond morality, it teaches us an important lesson. Systems do not tell us what they will mean. That's up to the people who invent and apply them. So today, when we reach for the systems model to describe the human being, we have to remember that we're speaking through a limited language for life that was developed to understand radioisotope and particle movement through nature, not designed to capture people, humans, and all their complexity. The model of the ecological self, particles and DNA, is a fruitful physiological map, but does not quite capture the people of the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels portrayed in the mural, nor the personal dramas of the lives of the scientists who made the bomb. Their experiences taught them so much more. Their reflection on what is right and what is wrong continues to unfold and remains unfinished. That doesn't make the systems models bad, but it does make them limited for describing what humans are and how we work. What I want to leave you with today is the idea that the story of the development of ecosystem sciences at Oak Ridge is not one of bare scientific thought reflecting the world back to us without any kind of refraction. These images of the world were shaped by philosophical reflection, some of which was performed through reflection on art and craft here in southern Appalachia, among many other aspects of its context, including, most importantly, military need. Counts and Nissley's stories are just two examples of thousands of times in the history of this lab, and a nearly infinite more times in the history of science, when the complexity of human experience expressed itself through science. Science reflects the complexity of who we are. Paying attention to this theme in the history of science can teach us much about what we know and how we know it, which I think deserves our attention. Thank you.